I want to thank a number of people for coming here. Above all, I'd like to have Elliot Hillback and Roberto Donato stand for a round of applause for bringing the DB4 convertible. My co-star this evening, an extraordinary specimen of the DB4, of any of the several models of DB4, and this is the New York show car in 1963, which is why it has distinctive finishes under the bonnet, which I'll touch on in a moment. The story to discuss tonight is how this tiny car company in England created a brand new model in the late 1950s, and I may as well start with the apocryphal story, not apocryphal story. David Brown was approached by Henry Ford, who wanted to buy a sports car company to sort of get a head start in sports car racing. And Hank the Deuce said, "Can I buy your company?" And David Brown, short little Yorkshireman, I mean, he makes me look gigantic, said, "No, absolutely not." Well, then he read in the Financial Times a year or so later what he had offered to buy Ferrari, and David Brown said, "Bloody hell, I didn't think he'd pay that much." And then, of course, you know the story of Ford versus Ferrari, which is a great story. And that's part of the rivalry and the history of the DB4 model. When post-war England started building cars again, David Brown cobbled together a car company, buying the assets of Aston Martin and the assets of Lagonda. His genius in buying Lagonda was that he got the, at the time, fairly advanced twin-cam engine that a fellow named W.O. Bentley had designed with Willie Watkins for the pre-war Lagonda. And that twin-cam six-cylinder engine propelled Aston Martin from the early 50s, from the DB2 model on through the DB4 Mark III, which was built through 1958. And anyway, going into the narrative, the DB4 prototype was designed in-house by a wonderful fellow named Frank Feely. And the British masters of Aston Martin said, "Well, it looks nice, but it looks pretty dull." In fact, it was dubbed by the Aston Martin staff as the Wall's ice cream van. It had all the excitement of an ice cream dispenser. And so they went to Carrozzeria Turin in Italy, and we have several distinguished Italians in the audience, thank you. The folks at Turin, once they got the dimensions down to pencil this design. And of course they used the row or the golden rule factor, that once they knew the wheelbase, then they could start figuring out what the envelope looked like. Now a little bit of side background, those are Maserati fans in the audience? The Maserati 3500 was also designed by Turing, so you'll see some common design language between the two models, and it's quite interesting. But it was an all-new car for Aston Martin to be developing in the late 50s, and so they had a new chassis, new engine, and of course a new body. And so when they did the testing, the test mule is what they dubbed the armored car. And you could tell this one really needs Italian styling. But it helped them figure out the platform chassis, which turned out to be a pretty well executed design that launched in 1958 and persisted through the DB4, DB5, DB6, the six-cylinder DB6, the stretched and widened DBS, and the chassis actually lived through the series of V8 coupes and through the Aston Martin Lagonda, the wedge that was the breakthrough car of the 1970s for Aston Martin. Same core chassis was extended, widened, lengthened, and it was even the Lagonda, which I've driven a few in the Berkshires, and they're actually fun cars to drive at 70 miles an hour in the mountains. You might not think so given their mass, but they're actually pretty cool cars. Well, there has been a tradition of racing Astons. This happens to be a Series 2 DB4. There are 5 series of DB4s, and you can tell the early DB4s have the cheese grater grill. A nice word in French for grill is calendar. It has the big air scoop and so forth. And shortly after that, came the DB4GT, which looks a lot like the Series 2 DB4 except it's 5 inches shorter, the so-called short wheelbase. The standard DB4 was meant to be a 2+2 tourer. And when it came out, it made its debut not in London in October 1958, as many hack journalists in Britain wrote, but it made its debut in Paris in September of 1958 through their distributor, Garage Mirabeau. And Mirabeau had a little party for their good customers. They had various literary giants. I think Francois Sagan had a couple of Aston Martins, actually 3 or 4 in the course of her career. Very big. One of the great Italian car journalists, the Etzerini author, wrote a great article about Francois Sagan and her sports cars, and renamed named that title Bonjour Vitesse, which those of you who've read Francois Sagan, her famous novel that vaulted her to global fame was Bonjour Tristesse, hello sadness. Well, vitesse or speed seems a lot more fun. But the DB4, including the one you see before you, has such clean lines, such remarkable purity of form that it was a hit. And I think in 1958, that's what sparked Jaguar to have to really think hard and go back to the drawing board when they came out with a new model called the XKE, which itself was a huge hit when it came out 3 years later. So the engine that was put into the Aston Martin was quite a story unto itself. It was concluded they had to make a bigger capacity engine. The Bentley engine was pretty much maxed out at not too far over 3 liters, whereas the engine in the DB456 from the get-go was started at 3.7 liters with the realization that it could go to 4.2 or 4.5. In fact, later, a few slides on, we'll see the homologation papers where the engine is homologated up to, I think, 4.2 liters, back in the 60s. So, and what you see here is Elliott's engine, the Elliott Hillback engine and the DB4 convertible here, which is an unusual show finish. It has polished cam covers, it has chrome-plated accelerator linkages, and black SU pots, and it's just a gorgeous beast. The funny story, when I met Elliott early on, I said, "Gee, Elliott, I don't think that's the correct finish. I think those cam covers are supposed to be painted." He said, "Nick, do you know the history of the car?" I said, "Oh." He said, "Nick, it was the New York show car." I said, "Oh, of course, it had the show car finishes, which is the polished camshafts. Otherwise, all the other Aston Martins have painted, gray painted camshaft covers, what you might call British toolbox mottled silver, a Sherwin-Williams paint called Dimenso that gives you that beautiful British toolbox kind of look." So anyway, I'm so chastened. I've always been in debt to Mr. Hillback for educating me. So anyway, great car. It went through 5 iterations. This is a very early DB4, which didn't have window frames. It had the simple cheese grater sort of grill. This one, it happens to be in Buenos Aires. And it also didn't have the oil cooler that came later. And the oil cooler came about after the first cars were delivered, and the first spate of failures happened in France. And John Wyer, the great general manager, who, by the way, who knows who John Wyer is? About a third, half folks. John Wyer was the general manager of Aston Martin at the time. He ran the race team for Aston's. And after he left Aston Martin, when David Brown decided he didn't want to continue racing after 1959, left to go to work for Ford on the GT40 project. And after that, Mr. Wyer went on to work for Porsche on the 917 and their World Championship. and then for Gulf Mirage and their World Championship. The point is that the engine was a very robust 6-cylinder engine, but the engineers had never had the experience of auto roots, which I'll get back to in a moment. The construction of the DB4 and onward through the DB5 was the superleggera method of touring, of hanging unstressed aluminium over a space frame of tubes. So the skin is unstressed, it's not structural, and so when you look at a naked pre-aluminum sheathing, DB4, DB5, that's what it looks like. This is a wrecked, burned out DB4 that belonged in a very early DB4, I might add, that I was actually asked to appraise for an insurance company. I'm not normally an insurance appraiser, but the insurance company couldn't find anybody else to come up with a value on a DB4. And that was in a garage outside of Akron, and so I took the job. And anyway, so this is the poor car, and you can tell the aluminium is simply melted away from the top of the car. And you can see, what's that?
What did you appraise it at?
200,000. So this is in somewhat recent years. The car behind you is worth a bit more than that, arguably, today. But and they were glad for a valuation that referenced recent auction prices and other sales. So anyway, so the DB4 was a great breakthrough car, and if that weren't enough, the Zagato folks got to talking to the Aston Martin folks and came up with the DB4 GT Zagato. And it was thought to be a clever way to extend the franchise with a slightly lighter body. And that's part of the whole tradition of Aston Martin heritage parts of keeping these things alive through the factory. The DB4, DB5 convertibles are relatively rare. They're actually more rare than the DB4 GT. Only 70 convertibles were built like Elliott's, making it more rare than a DB4 GT. You might ask, who was the competition for Aston Martin? Well, Ferrari was the competition, Maserati was the competition, Jaguar was the competition, but then they also had in-house competition. David Brown wanted to have his four-door Lagonda. So this tiny company, stretched for resources, was trying to make a four-door car as well as a short wheelbase car. The upshot is that the fact that Aston Martin got these different models out is no small miracle. This car was in Boston a few years ago. It was bought new out of Garage Mirabeau in Paris by a fellow named Murray, who was a naval attaché. He sounded like he might have been a candidate for substituting for James Bond as a Navy commander. But this was an unusual Zagato, and that it had twin magnetos instead of distributors, and just an absolutely gorgeous car. And you'll notice numbers on that. Many of the DB4 GTs were raced at one point or another. This is the prototype, which is presented here at Le Mans with an experimental 3-liter engine driven by the Swiss distributor Hubert Paté and Lausanne. And the 3-liter engine was not well proven and only lasted a few hours, but he was in the fray. Anyway, moving right along, the DB4 was a good car. It wasn't raced so much in period, but there was a couple crazy people from around here that would race these things in various events and have fun. Here we are at Road America. Should you be going to Oshkosh Fly-In, Mr. Hassaway, I think you're a Fly-In fan?
I've been 19 times.
19 times, okay. Oshkosh only 19 times. Wow. At some point you'll want to go the week before and go down to Elkhart Lake, which is 30 miles away, and see what sort of foolishness goes on there. But this happens to be Sebring. This is the lawn in Elkhart Lake at the Oshoff Resort. But the people have been running these cars at speed for some time. The Zagatos proved very potent, and in a very interesting interview that Griff Borgeson had in Automobile Quarterly, Mr. Borgeson interviewed Giotto Bizzarini on the history of how the GTO was developed. And Mr. Bizzarini said the #1 propellant for Enzo to move on from the 250 GT Berlinetto, what we call the short wheelbase today, was the Zagato, Aston Martin. So rattled his nerves, he thought they were onto something with a shorter wheelbase and having, well, even more Italian content. And you know, there's Italian content all over these cars, as you may gather. The Monza filler cap is only one clue. The Zagato form is just distinctive, whereas the controls are quite British, I think. Sort of the Spitfire pilots will appreciate the gauges. I would note this is a Zagato interior, which is pretty much a standard DB4 GT. The advertising that was done for Aston Martin was pretty limited because they were a tiny company. They didn't have a big budget. We're not talking General Motors buying a couple pages in Look magazine, but they decided it'd be fun to have a measure of how quickly it could go from 0 to 100 and then back to 0. And they did that at the Myra Test Center and managed to do that in 100 seconds, and nobody had thought of that as a performance index. And you'll recall, this is the era when disc brakes were just starting. And you Ferrari tifosi, you Ferrari fans will know that Mr. Ferrari was quoted as saying, "I don't make my cars to stop, I make them to go." And only at the last second, when the 250 GT Berlinetta was on the stand the night before the Paris Salon opened, the crew from Modena hung four-wheel disc brakes on the new short wheelbase. They did it literally at the auto show, not at the factory, because they decided the message had finally come through, these disc brakes are not going to go away, maybe we ought to consider using them. But that was a remarkable bit of progress. The DB5 was the next model, which looks almost identical to the DB4. The difference is it's a little bit longer. It's got the 3 taillights in the back, which started with the Series 4 DB4s, and then a few other features like the sturdy bumpers with so forth. It's often tough to tell the difference between a DB4 and a DB5. Back to the GTs. The GTs were often put into races literally fresh off the boat. This is Bahamas in 1961. This is chassis 135, which had literally come in just about the same time as 133 did, which is white. And it was entered at Bahamas Speed Week and driven very aggressively, very well, but not necessarily perfectly. In the first turn, on the first lap, it got a little bit squeezed by a Ferrari 250. And, but don't worry, it's all metal. It all, you know. My friends in Arlington, Mass. Arlington guys, how many Arlington people are there here? Hanging in the back of the classroom. That's where the troublemakers are, right? Anyway, the usual joke when people see a damaged car on somebody's Facebook page is the usual joke is that'll all buff out. Well, here is the same car on the showroom floor at Inskip after the body work had been done post. That was Sebring. That was a Sebring shot. So, also at Sebring, there's a guy named Sterling Moss who was a regular around the Aston Martin family. Quite a great guy. This is when Sterling had hair. And next to him is one of the greatest guys in Aston Martin history, period, in the world, Rex J. Woodgate, who became president of Aston Martin America from the 60s through the late 70s. And that's Rex J. Woodgate, who kept a lot of people running. And he also kept a lot of Chevy engines out of Aston Martins, I might add. This is a young Rex next to the same number 135 DB4 GT that it had that beautiful rash on it from arguing with the Ferrari. But Rex was the kind of guy that would keep his cars running, the Aston Martins running, and then help other people. And in 1959, normally the New York Times would award the Mechanics Award to a IndyCar mechanic, but for that year gave it to Rex Woodgate because he had been such an extraordinary presence on the sports car racing circuit. So as they went through the various venues from Le Mans, The next place is one of the most sacred places in Aston lore. Outside of Le Mans, in a nearby village, is the Hotel de France, which is where John Wyer said, I'm going to put my crew up in a rural town where they're not going to have the big plaza celebrations and parties to have them get into trouble. And so this is the Hotel de France, which is sort of a pilgrimage, should you be in the Sarthe and doing the rounds of important places around Le Mans. And that very classic moments of racing. And I would submit that for the British, Le Mans, or Le Mans, is to Europe what the Indy 500 is as a touchstone event, the big show. And so if you win on Le Mans, you can sell cars on Monday. So back to how these cars are made. This is a DB4 convertible that had been brought in from England, belonged to a woman sportscaster in Chicago for many years, and it was unusual in that it had a hardtop. And not only a hardtop, but a hardtop with a Webasto sunroof. So if you were a little bit ambivalent when you wanted your sunshine, well, here's your solution. Get a hardtop with a sunroof. So anyway, great car. Unfortunately, it did not come to Boston, but I have yet to see another DB4 sunroof. Anyway, we mentioned the Paris debut in September of '58. That was a seminal moment for Aston Martin. And the reason France was especially important in developing the car was their motorways were more active than Britain's were at the time. And the reason this was important is that in the spring of '58, '59, there was a spate of engine failures in France. And John Wyer sent the engine designer, Tad Merrick, over to France to investigate. And after a few days, engineer Merrick calls back, long distance in those days, very expensive. He says, I found a common problem. And Wyer said, oh great, what's the common problem? He said, they all happened on Good Friday. What? Well, Good Friday is the start of Holy Week vacations. And there was a gentleman's informal contest to see who could get from Paris to the coast first, whether they were with their nieces or whoever, that there was an informal race, if you will, from Paris to the coast. And in the old pre-motorway days, you scream along on a straightaway for 3 or 4 miles, then you'd come to a roundabout, slow down, change to the gears, the engine would cool down, then you'd speed up again and come to another roundabout, slow down, the engine would cool, etc. Well, with the motorways, you could just go 110 miles an hour all the time. And this brand new aluminium engine was expanding once it got really hot, far more than anybody imagined would happen. And that caused the engine, the bearings to spin. And so the solution was to add an oil cooler. And I believe the oil capacity of this car on the DB5's forward is all about 3 gallons of oil, 12 quarts of oil. And that's how engine cooling was solved by Aston Martin. Now, in the midst of the 60s, we also had fun stuff going on, like novels and writers and things becoming movies. Well, there's a guy named Ian Fleming who had a really great hero named James Bond. And in the movie, in the book, Goldfinger, Mr. Bond is driving an early mid-50s Aston Martin DB4 Mark III with the old Bentley engine. And by the time the movie came out, thank you, Broccoli family, in 1964, the DB5 was the new model. So, of course, they went to the new model, which was actually, those of you who know the story, know that the DB5s in the movie are actually rebadged late DB4s, but they had to look like the newest model because the movie was coming out when the DB5 was going to be out, and they wanted to have the latest, greatest car possible. And most women don't mind my showing a picture of Sean Connery. So, but there's Sean Connery in the DB5. In the midst of all this glamorous stuff, John Wyer had been getting the new DB4 out. He'd been with them since the late war. And John Wyer was highly regarded as a brilliant team manager and strategist. For example, when they won in 1959, his strategy was to send Sterling Moss out as the rabbit, knowing the Ferrari guys could not stand to not let him go ahead of them. And sure enough, the Ferrari people chased Sterling Moss. And by the time Sterling Moss's engine blew up in the course of the night, the Ferraris were burning out too. And his strategy was to use Moss as bait to break the Ferraris. And that strategy worked quite nicely. Thank you. When I went out to interview John, Mr. Wyer, in 1988, the year before he died, I brought along a couple copies of his books. And one he had published in '56 called Motor Racing Management. And he inscribed it to me with the message, Nick, I wrote this when I thought I knew something about the subject. And his point was, after 1956, he had learned so much more about race strategy and team management that he then applied to the Ford GT40 program, that he applied to the Porsche 917 program, that he applied to the Gulf Mirage program. But in the midst of all this racing, some of these cars ended up going on the track. And here's the cover of Sports Car Graphic from, I think, 1961. And the red DB4GT in the background was road tested and found to be a little bit soft in the rear suspension, a little bit cornering like the Queen Mary in a gale. And when you see Aston Martins in the rare times that they're racing these days, we have figured out how to solve these problems. And when Wyer homologated these cars with the FIA, he homologated them not only with the horrible lever shocks. Anybody love lever shocks here? Is there a fan of lever shocks? He also homologated them with telescopic shocks, which make for a much stiffer ride. In the course of evolving the DB4 GT, that engine actually started as an experimental engine before the DB4 came out in the DBR2 race car, the sports racer. And the race shop juiced it up with twin plug ignition, dual coils, dual distributors, a higher compression ratio, more aggressive cam grind. And that was a great engine. Very similar to the engine in this DB4, just a little bit more aggressive. And when you're trying to defeat the forces of darkness of Joseph Lucas, 2 spark plugs is better than 1. When the GT made its first public appearance on Bank Holiday in a sports car race, although you can quibble, I think Sheldon Steele has a beautiful Jaguar Mark II, and he might say, is it really fair to race a 4-door Jaguar Mark II against a 2-door Aston Martin? I can't speak to that. But anyway, the point is, Moss won that event, and that was not bad advertising. The prototype DB4 GT came out in the May Bank Holiday of 1959, and that was a pretty good thing to do. There are a couple of modern Aston Martin owners here. For years, there's been a tradition that Aston Martin owners like to party, and this just happens to be a cute picnic of a bunch of Zagatos. And I'm sure there's, French style, a couple of open picnic baskets, and somebody's popping corks somewhere. A number of the DB4 GT Zagatos were run at events, and there's a lot of history there. You may or may not have mentioned that I wrote a book. There's an example here, 544 pages of more than you can possibly want to know about the subject. So, as the 60s were moving on, in the early 60s, 62, 63, 62, 63, the race department came up with a couple of specials. Here's Graham Hill with the next evolution of a different take on the DB4 GT, the DP212, a little bit more aerodynamic and a little bit more aggressive engine, same core engine. And by the time the 60s went through, they had developed the DP214, which was still badged as a DB4 GT, and they made 2 of those. Only one exists today, belonged to Simon Draper, the publisher of Pelham Books. The other was destroyed in a crash at the Nürburgring. And then there was one more model built that was actually almost really not a GT, called the DP215, that looks like it. The 15 is the DP215. But these were incredibly effective GT cars. When put into racetracks with GTOs, they were on a par pretty much with the GTO. History stopped paying attention to Aston Martin once David Brown said he's not interested in racing anymore. But at September 1963, Monza, the Coppa d'Italia, two DB4GT project cars, these two here, the DP214, ran in the Coppa d'Italia in Monza and beat 5 GTOs. And in Germany, a guy in a lightweight DB4 GT, Peter Lindemann, who was the Jaguar Aston Martin importer, in an ADAC race beat something like 5 short wheelbases. And the irony was that when they wanted to be, Aston Martin could be competitive or on par, with parity with Aston Martin's best, with Ferrari's best Grand Touring cars. But Mr. Brown, unlike Mr. Ferrari, did not live to race. He wanted to go do something else. So, but Mr. Wire told me these were easy cars to make. They were easily fabricated. The engines were already well proven. A bit on the Italian content, you'll notice the carburetors on many of the performance Aston Martins of the era were Webers. The wheels were Barani. Elliott has Barani wheels on this DB4 convertible. What's the benefit of a Barani wheel? Also the fact they're gorgeous in aluminum, much prettier than a painted gray Dunlop wheel. The aluminum wheels weigh 5 pounds less per wheel than the steel wheel. A pound off the rotating mass is worth 4 pounds off the chassis. So that's taking each wheel at 5 pounds off each wheel times 4 wheels. So that's taking 80 pounds off the mass of the vehicle for braking, accelerating, cornering. And the Baranis were a premium option on Aston Martin since the 50s. Very cool choice. They were pioneers with disc brakes. At one point, Girling tried to tell Aston Martin they couldn't have 4-wheel disc brakes, that they could only have disc brakes on the front, that they're supply constrained. And Mr. Wire said, we can't have anything less than Jaguar. Either you give us 4-wheel disc brakes or we're going to go to somebody else, and they ended up giving them 4-wheel disc brakes. And since then, braking has been one of the extraordinary qualities of Aston Martins to this day. The chassis was relatively light as well as robust. Here you can see the holes in the chassis for lightning, which was one way to have the strength of steel without all the mass and so forth. And if they had been able to keep going and make those cars, like that would have been Henry Ford's solution to creating the Cobra, very bluntly. So great cars and incredibly competent. There's also a tradition of fixing Aston Martins. The car in primer is the DP215. Someone had taken it out on the newly opened, or yet to almost to be opened, M1 motorway for some high-speed testing and made an error and rolled it a few times. And so, of course, Aston Martin said, well, it's a historic car, we're going to fix it. You'd see occasionally reports that a certain car was written off, and almost none of the DB4 GTs were really written off. 2 have been certifiably rebuilt, written off, 2 have been destroyed. But they're great cars, and between the Zagato, of which 19 chassis plates were delivered, and that's one of the funny things about Aston Martin lore. Lucien Bianchi had borrowed a DB4 GT Zagato and wrecked it at Spa, and it was a customer's car. So to fix it, Aston Martin brought it back to Newport Pagnell, and looking at the wreckage, decided to slip the old chassis plate on a brand new chassis. So there are actually 20 Zagatos built, but only 19 chassis plates. And since the considerable British taxes had already been paid on that previous chassis number, that was a slick way to get through the situation. So keep that in mind if you're in a high tax environment, what sort of cunning your people can be counted on for. Again, it was a great car, symbolic car. This is the prototype DP199 with the Swiss stripes, which has since been re-restored. But that was not a successful entry at Le Mans in 1959, but still a really cool car. Still a really cool engine. I invite you to look over Elliott's engine. It's a gorgeous piece of industrial art. This happens to have the Webers on it. This happens to have the twin ignition. But you'll notice at the front of the engine there's a beautifully crafted oil filler cap that's magnetically kept in place for when you're putting those 12 quarts in. The block is aluminum with steel liners. The head's aluminum with aluminum cam covers. The engine has proven to be very robust and last a long time. And I think the caption on this, in one picture that Aston Martin did, was "Airplane without wings." So, again, they were great cars. They were put to the test of combat. And I happened, as a kid, for some reason, buy the SCCA rule book, and much to my amazement in later years discovered that the DB4GT and the DB4 were homologated in there, and they were homologated with telescopic shocks and bigger engines. So anyway, as I mentioned, a lot of these had boo-boos along the way, but they almost all got rebuilt. This was actually a husband-wife collision on the race course, but let's not talk about that. Here is a picture that has, to me, one of the most magic moments in Gran Turismo history and evolution. It's my DB4 GT, chassis 130, in red in the middle, sandwiched between one of the 7 long wheelbase 250 GTs that was built before Ferrari made them short wheelbases. Now, everybody knows the short wheelbase because it's so famous. Many people aren't aware that Ferrari built 7 long wheelbase GTs before shortening it. And my theory, personal theory, is that Aston did that in reaction to Aston Martin, and they didn't shorten it from the get-go because the old chassis had been homologated under the 250 Tour de France, and having the wheelbase change might have been one more thing too many, so that's what happened. I mentioned that France was and I'm so glad we have French people with us. This is a little book that I bought in an auto store off the Champs-Élysées years ago, Aston Martin, all the history. The distributor, the dealer in Paris, was very influential. And when the DB4 came out, it was a smash hit. David Brown was thrilled. He took John Wyer out to dinner at Fouquet's, a very chic bistro in Paris. I believe popular with show business people. I dined there on expense account a few years ago, but and I recommend the expense account. But anyway, the point is, at Fouquet's, David Brown was asked by John Wyer. He said, "Our distributor is saying, can you give me a 2-seater to compete with the 250 Tour de France?" And that's how the DB4 GT came about. So the oh, Mike is dying? I'll project. How's this? Okay. What's that? Oh yeah, Prince of Darkness. Anyway, we're in the home stretch here. A couple more slides. The point is that the GT came about because the French agent asked for a two-seater to compete with the 250 Tour de France. And David Brown gave the go-ahead at the dinner, and that was in September '58. By spring, they had the prototype GT, and then Bank Holiday, they had the initial race with Sterling Moss, which was successful. Modern history, last two slides. Ford acquired Aston in '87. Later, they acquired Jaguar and Volvo, and made the Performance Automotive Group. 20 years later, Aston Martin was spun off. It's since gone through a couple of other ownership changes. The present chairman of the board is Lawrence Stroll from Quebec. The DB7 was considered to be the modern Aston that brought Aston back into the contention as a serious car maker. Yes, it was derived from the XJS platform, but it was a distinct car, and the engine, the inline six, started as a Jaguar engine, but had the Eaton supercharger, which was first used on the Ford Thunderbird Super Coupe in 1989. That Eaton did specifically for Ford Motor, and turns out to have been a very good formula for the DB7 as arguably the most successful car in Aston Martin's history in terms of numbers of examples built. The Vanquish, starting in Newport Pagnell, there's one Vanquish owner here, was a breakthrough platform in carbon fiber, and you've seen some of the more modern examples in the hypercar category. And yes, the V8 Jaguar was a starting point for the modern Vantage, but it's different and it's engineered differently. And you look under the bonnet of any of the V8 Vantage Roadsters or coupes. To me, I look at the dry sump, stainless steel accumulator for the oil as a bit of industrial art that lets Aston Martin lower the engine to have a lower bonnet line and better aerodynamics. And that's an example of, I think, brilliant British engineering, figuring out how to do the job better. So anyway, onward from here, I will just say in closing that I will add this as a tribute to the great John Wyer. Here John is with his wife, Tottie. Tottie was dubbed by Graham Hill. For some reason, he referred to her as Old Haddock, but and she never understood why. But anyway, that was a term of affection. But when I went out to interview him in '88, when he was out of the room, his wife quietly turned to me and she said, "You know what I'm proudest of John for? Nobody ever died driving for him. Drivers died driving for that other guy." And that was her point about the goodness of John Wyer, that he could win races and bring everybody home. So anyway, just as a tribute to John Wyer, who with a plucky little British company got a whole bunch of stuff done, and that company is alive today. So that's it. That's a short history of the DB4, more than you may want to know, but I figured that might be fun to share this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there questions? Better yet, are there answers?
I have had a whole wonderful chance to have a lot of really cool cars. Ferrari, I had some other cars, they're nice cars. This was always our favorite, my wife's favorite, everybody's. But make sure, if you're gonna have a great car like this, get it out on the road, drive it around. There's a bunch of people, some of them are in this room, that used to go with me and with a whole bunch of cars, not all mine and not all theirs, but some other friends. And we'd go up to Watkins Glen and have a great weekend at the big vintage weekend, and come back, have a great time. And so there's lots of, don't park it in the garage, because time comes too long and time comes too fast, and don't lose it. Thanks.
Thank you all. I might mention that Elliot had an exquisite array of GT cars, and he is my star for gourmet collection of GT cars. So, without going into that, anyway, the story about the other convertible was our friend Dr. Tom wanted to know why he couldn't sell his car for as much as the Peter Ustinov DB4 convertible went. And I said, very simply, Tom, because Peter Ustinus Tush was not in your seat. There is a bit of a provenance thing. So whether it's Mick Jagger with his DB6 or Princess Di leaving cheek marks on the DB6 convertible, it's, that's where the funny phrase provenance comes in.
Two questions. Did they ever do a DB4GT convertible? And I know you did a book about the GT. How many cars did you not find?
Excellent question. Though there was never a DB4 GT convertible done, at least none that the factory did, somebody in France did a sort of quasi-Zagato, fake Zagato special roadster out of a DB4, which was kind of an interesting looking car, except it's not a real car. It wasn't a factory car. It was, Francois's idea of a cool car to make in his barn. And then to accounting for the 101 Aston Martin DB4 GTs built, which is made up of 75 standard DB4 GTs with some subsets in that, 19 Zagatos, nominally, with those serial numbers, and then 5 prototypes or race cars. There were 101 GTs. Of the cars that were built, I thought one turned out to be no longer existing. And it turns out there's another one that the chassis number, after it was trashed, after it was destroyed, was recycled. On the case of the one that I'm familiar with, that I was asked to look at by a very famous restoration shop that shall go unnamed, I was asked to take a look at this car, and underneath the front chassis member, if you want to crawl underneath Elliot's car, I'm sure he'd be glad to let you get the grease off of it. There is about an 1.5 inch wide steel tube cross member. Stamped on that is the chassis number on all DB4s. On the particular car in question, I'm looking at this, and it's very clear somebody took a grinder and ground down about 1/8 of an inch of the steel to stamp some fresh numbers on there. Which was my way of saying, I'm sorry, but this is a forgery. So it's not often you get to do forensic mechanics work. But when you're looking at a car that's worth maybe $1 million, and it's being passed off as a car that's worth $2.5 million, that $1.5 million constitutes, I don't know, what's the word for it? Fraud. Forgery. So there are very few forged Aston Martins around. There's an old joke, yeah, I was out at Cavallino, yeah, all 12 of the original 7 250 Californias were there. Meaning there are a lot of clone Ferraris out there. A lot of 250 GTEs get chopped into making some more fancy version of the 250 series with that engine. Because the British are so ANRAC. ANRAC means geek, means train spotter, means they fuss over what's the chassis number. And people track that. So, oh, I just saw, oh, that's 1083 stroke L right there. Because people obsess over that stuff, people don't get away with fake Aston Martins very easily. And it's sort of an interesting thing, which is not to say anything against the Ferrari world, which is a wonderful world. I've had a little bit of a dabble in it. But there are relatively few fake Aston Martins floating around. So whereas you look at the world of Shelby Cobras, and unfortunately it's a question of, is that real? Or is that a, Force 5 from Cape Cod or whatever that is? And there are a lot of fake Cobras out there. And, but there's nothing like a real one. So anyway, other questions? Sir, Mr. Diamond.
You mentioned, what were there, 5 series of DB4s, is that right?
Yes.
So there were 5. So I recall reading years ago, I think that there were differences in the wheel sizes or something from one to another. Never understand what the rationale for that was. Maybe you could explain that. And I'm just curious what some of the other differences were from 1 to 5.
The evolutionary changes, and there's a website called astonmartins.com that explains it very well. It's produced by a retired pharmacist in Waltham, England. You know where Waltham is, obviously, because you're here. Well, this is Waltham, England, and the website is astonmartins.com, and that website explains very clearly what those 5 categories are. And interestingly, it was one of our California members 50 years ago who said, we need some nomenclature to understand what series Aston Martin is. So a guy in California came up with Series 1, Series 2, Series 3. And so the differences are the first DB4s were on 16-inch wheels, the last ones were on 15-inch wheels. The taillights on the earliest DB4s are what we call the cathedral taillights. They look like the Alvis taillights because they are, whereas the later ones have these beautifully stacked 3-color lenses, as you see on Elliott's exquisite car. And the other improvements included things such as improving the oil ducts, adding the oil cooler, adding more ducts to cool the engine, and then a few other subtle changes, like length. The car grew a couple inches over the years. So did that help? Did that start, Mark?
Why did they go to a smaller wheel? Why did they go from 16 to 15 inch?
Radial tires were not on the horizon yet, and wire wheels were the hot setup for brake cooling until people started getting G-forces that said wire wheels are at the end of their tether. And by the way, disc brakes cool better than drum brakes, so you don't need wire wheels so much anymore to cool your brakes. The wire wheels stayed on through the DBS model, which is the new Towns design that looks like the later V8s. When the car came out, the V8 wasn't ready, so they put the well-proven 6-cylinder engine in it and kept it on wire wheels. When they got to the V8 engine, with more torque, more power, they suddenly went to cast wheels because these suckers could accelerate faster and corner faster. And those side loads, when you look at the early 60s racing reports, you'll see the occasional story that so-and-so's right rear wheel, the wire basket collapsed about the 20th lap. That literally the wire wheels would stress brake, especially on a brutal track like Sebring, which is just rough concrete and divider strips. I drove my DB4 there on my one and only run at Sebring. I said, man, this is brutal. And sure enough, by the end of the race weekend, my tires were toast. The same thing, the fatigue on wheels is significant. But if that helps address that, Mark, it was just an evolution in car design, just as cars then went from the radial tires were a great improvement, so that even the best Dunlop racing tire was not as good as Michelin XWX for cornering, road holding, braking. The radials were just proven advantage over even the very best that Dunlop or Avon or Goodyear could make in a conventional bias ply tire. I'd like to once again thank Elliott Hillback and Roberto Donato for getting the DB4 convertible here. It is just such an exquisite example. I want to thank my wife, who's in the front row, for suffering through me after all these years. God bless you. And I'd also like to thank our number of friends from a number of distinguished places, from Gilles Motte, who came up from Rhode Island. Bienvenue, Gilles. There are some other French speakers on this end of the room, so make sure you say bonsoir before the evening's over. And I want to thank Mei Lin and Sheldon for hosting this event. Thank you very much.